The alien fleets laughed when the human warship emerged from the jump point. It was small, laughably small, against the vastness of the Arindal expanse, where cruisers stretched for kilometers and dreadnoughts cast shadows across entire moons. The human vessel looked like a misplaced courier craft. Its hull bore no ornate crests, no intimidating weapon arrays, no glowing energy spines that marked power among the great interstellar empires. It was compact, angular, utilitarian, more tool than symbol. The coalition commanders watched from their command decks, surrounded by holograms of their own armadas. Thousands of ships, layered in disciplined formations, radiated confidence. This region of space had never known resistance. Entire civilizations had folded under far less pressure. And now, this, a single human warship. The laughter rippled across command channels, translated instantly across dozens of species. Some mistook it for arrogance. Others for desperation. A few dismissed it as a scouting error. An expendable probe sent too late to matter. None of them felt fear. The human ship did not respond to the taunts. It did not broadcast threats or raise shields dramatically. It drifted forward, engines humming with a quiet, steady rhythm, as if unaware of the overwhelming force arrayed before it. Its hull reflected distant starlight softly, showing scars, old ones, micrometeor impacts, heat scoring, repairs layered upon repairs. This ship had been places. Coalition sensors swept over it again and again. Power output registered as minimal. Weapon signatures were strange. Not weak, not strong, just unfamiliar. The algorithms struggled to categorize them. The alien admirals assumed malfunction. They tightened their formations anyway, more out of habit than concern. A single shot from any cruiser would vaporize the human vessel. A warning volley was unnecessary. This was a demonstration zone, a reminder of coalition dominance. The order was given. A battleship on the front line powered its main cannons, energy building in luminous arcs along its spinal array. The weapon had shattered continents. It had ended wars before they truly began. Before it could fire, the human ship moved. Not fast, not aggressively. It adjusted position by a fraction, aligning itself along an invisible axis that only it seemed to perceive. Internal systems synchronized in silence. Mass dampeners recalibrated. Space-time readings stabilized. On board the human vessel, there was no panic. No shouted commands. Only measured breaths, steady hands, and eyes fixed on data streams older than the coalition itself. This was not a ship designed for intimidation. It was designed for certainty. The alien battleship fired. A beam of coherent energy lanced across space, brilliant enough to light the expanse like a newborn star. Sensors tracked its path with absolute confidence. There was no evasion vector that could save a ship that small. The beam passed through where the human warship had been. Not because it dodged, because it was no longer there in the way the coalition understood there to mean. The human vessel reappeared a short distance away. Not via jump, not via fold, not via any known propulsion method. Space itself seemed to hesitate around it, like a breath held too long. Coalition sensors screamed warnings. Physics models collapsed. Targeting systems lost lock, reacquired, lost lock again. The laughter stopped. The human ship rotated slightly, nose aligning with the center of the alien formation. 1,000 weapons locked onto it instantly, overlapping fields of fire ready to erase the anomaly before it could repeat whatever trick it had just performed. Still, the human vessel did not flee. Its weapon systems powered up. Only one. Coalition analysts scoffed even as their displays filled with unreadable data. A single forward-mounted emitter, compact, unadorned, drawing power not explosively but steadily. As if the ship were borrowing energy rather than consuming it. A few senior commanders felt unease creep into their thoughts. Not fear, yet, but the recognition that something fundamental was being misunderstood. They had seen weapons before. This was not one of them. The human ship fired. There was no flash, no thunderous discharge, no dramatic beam. Reality simply bent. A narrow line extended from the human vessel, not glowing, not dark, but absent. Space along its path flattened into something impossibly thin. It crossed the distance to the alien battleship in less than a heartbeat. The battleship did not explode. It did not break apart. It ceased. One moment it existed, massive, powerful, undeniable. The next, it was gone. No debris, no radiation surge, no shockwave, just an empty volume of space where something enormous had once been. Coalition command froze. Sensors searched frantically, recalibrating, expanding ranges, checking alternate dimensions, subspace layers, gravitational echoes. Nothing registered. The ship was not destroyed. It was removed. Silence fell across the fleet. The human vessel powered its weapon down. Energy levels returned to baseline. The ship drifted again, unthreatening, almost humble. And then a transmission went out. Not a threat, not a declaration of war. A simple, clear signal, broadcast on every known coalition frequency, translated flawlessly into every language. It was short. It stated a fact. This ship was not armed for battle. It was armed for conclusion. Coalition commanders stared at their displays, their confidence bleeding away into something colder, heavier. This had not been a lucky shot. Not a secret superweapon unleashed in desperation. This had been a demonstration. One ship, one shot, one absence where a fleet centerpiece had been. The human vessel adjusted course slightly, positioning itself directly between the coalition armada and the human frontier beyond. Its presence was calm, unyielding. It did not threaten to fire again. It did not need to. Because now, every alien admiral understood the truth they had mocked moments earlier. They were not facing a tiny warship. They were facing a line humanity had drawn, and crossing it would not lead to battle. It would lead to erasure. And as coalition fleets hesitated for the first time in recorded history, the human ship waited, silent and steady, holding the fate of the engagement without firing another shot. The silence after the shot was worse than any explosion. Across the coalition armada, command bridges filled with the soft chime of error alerts and recalibration loops. Tactical displays refreshed again and again, refusing to accept what every pair of eyes had already seen. The space where the battleship had existed remained stubbornly empty. A void too clean, too absolute to be the aftermath of destruction. Veteran admirals felt something tighten inside them. Fleets were built on certainty, on known weapons, known losses, known physics. This was none of those things. This was subtraction. Orders came in half-formed bursts. Defensive formations were tightened, then loosened, then tightened again as algorithms failed to produce a stable response. Weapons crews sat ready, fingers hovering over firing commands that no one dared to authorize. The human ship remained still, a quiet blemish against the stars, radiating the unsettling calm of something that had already proven it did not need to hurry. Coalition doctrine dictated overwhelming force. Thousands of ships could erase a single target by volume alone. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. To fire now would mean committing to an equation whose variables were unknown. No one knew how many shots it would take before the human ship decided to fire again. No one knew what again would mean. The human frontier lay just beyond sensor range, a web of faint signals and gravity wells marking colonies that, until moments ago, had been considered ripe for annexation. Easy gains, soft worlds, the kind of expansion the coalition had performed 100 times before. Now, those worlds felt distant, protected not by fleets, but by implication. The human ship transmitted again. This time, the message was longer. It carried no malice, no theatrical bravado. It spoke with a tone that was almost instructional. It explained that the vessel before them was not unique. It was representative, one of many, built not to dominate territory, but to enforce boundaries. Humanity, the message said, had learned long ago that deterrence was not about appearing powerful. It was about being precise. Coalition analysts parsed every word. Cultural experts flagged anomalies. There was no demand for tribute. No threat of retaliation. Only a clear statement of consequence. Cross this line, and assets will be removed. Not destroyed. Removed. The word echoed in alien minds. Removal implied intent beyond victory. It implied choice. Behind the calm transmission lay an unspoken question: where did the removed ship go? Some species whispered of dimensional exile. Others theorized matter conversion or temporal displacement. A few suggested annihilation so complete that even quantum remnants were erased. None of the theories were comforting. A junior officer, eyes fixed on long-range scans, reported a strange reading. A faint distortion far from the engagement zone. Too distant to confirm, too weak to analyze. Command dismissed it as sensor noise. But the human ship adjusted its orientation slightly, as if acknowledging the report. That subtle movement unsettled the admirals more than any aggressive maneuver could have. Coalition leadership convened an emergency council, encrypted channels buzzing with overlapping authority claims. Some argued for immediate withdrawal, to regroup and analyze. Others insisted that allowing a single human ship to dictate terms would shatter the coalition's image of invincibility. Empires were not maintained by caution, they argued, but by decisive action. A compromise emerged, a probe strike, unmanned, expendable, automated. A swarm of attack drones, stripped of crew and complexity, programmed to saturate the target from multiple vectors. If the human weapon required intent to activate, if it required a crew to justify its use, then machines might slip through the cracks. The order was given quietly, almost apologetically. Hundreds of drones launched from hidden bays, accelerating to attack speed in perfect synchronization. They fanned out, their trajectories unpredictable, weapons primed to fire simultaneously. No single shot, no single line, a storm. The human ship did not react immediately. No evasive maneuvers, no weapon charge. It waited. As the drones crossed a calculated threshold, the human vessel emitted a pulse, not of energy, but of alignment. Space around it stiffened, like a sheet drawn taut. The drone's guidance systems faltered, suddenly unsure of reference points that had always existed. Then the human ship fired again. This time, the effect was different. Instead of a single line, the absence bloomed outward in a shallow cone. It did not race toward the drones. It waited for them to enter it. One by one, then in clusters, the drones vanished as they crossed an invisible boundary. No resistance, no delay, they were simply no longer part of the universe the Coalition could observe. The swarm collapsed in seconds. Coalition Command watched the drone count tick down to 0 without a single confirmed hit. Something broke then. Not in space, but in understanding. This was not a weapon that chased targets. It was a rule. The human ship powered down again. Its systems returned to idle. It did not press the advantage. It did not advance. It held position. That restraint was more terrifying than aggression. It suggested confidence not just in the weapon, but in the outcome. Humanity did not need to annihilate the Coalition fleet to win this encounter. They only needed to make escalation irrational. Across the Armada, captains stared at their crews. Some crews stared back, awaiting orders that did not come. Others avoided eye contact, suddenly aware that the hierarchy they trusted might not have answers. A senior Coalition admiral finally authorized a full sensor sweep of the human vessel at maximum resolution, consequences be damned. The data that came back was fragmented, partially occluded by distortions no one could model. But buried within the noise were hints, layers of redundant systems. Structures folded into spaces smaller than they should have been, energy pathways looping in nonlinear patterns. This ship was not advanced by Coalition standards. It was different. It was built by a species that had stopped asking whether something was possible, and started asking whether it was necessary. The human message came one final time, softer now, almost reflective. It spoke of first contact mistakes, of lessons learned when humanity had been the smaller power, of borders violated, worlds burned, and the quiet resolve that followed. It did not accuse the Coalition. It simply stated that humanity had survived long enough to choose how it would be approached. The transmission ended. The human ship remained. Coalition leadership faced an impossible decision. To retreat would fracture alliances, invite rebellion, and signal weakness across the galaxy. To attack would mean committing fleets to an enemy that could subtract them from existence without visible effort. And somewhere, far beyond Coalition sensors, something shifted. Another faint distortion, growing stronger, as if the universe itself were preparing space for what came next. The human ship did not look back. It did not need to. Because the battle was already over. And the war, if the Coalition insisted on one, would not be fought on terms they understood. Fear did not spread through the Coalition fleet like panic. It spread like cold, a slow, creeping awareness that settled into every command deck and engine bay. Into every data core and living mind. Panic was loud. Panic burned itself out. This was different. This was the understanding that the rules everyone had trusted were no longer intact. The Coalition Armada remained in formation, but it was a formation born of inertia rather than intent. Ships drifted on carefully balanced vectors, engines humming at standby, weapons locked but unfired. Every second that passed without action deepened the unease. The human vessel had not moved since its last shot. It did not pursue. It did not posture. It simply existed, small and unassuming, at the edge of a territory that had suddenly become untouchable. Deep within Coalition Command, probability engines ran simulations by the millions. Every scenario ended the same way, uncertainty cascading into unacceptable loss. No model could reliably predict the human weapon's limitations because it did not behave like a weapon at all. It behaved like a boundary condition in reality itself. Reports filtered in from across the fleet. Long-range sensors were picking up anomalies where the destroyed battleship and drone swarm had vanished. Not debris, not radiation, voids in the data, like blind spots carved into space-time. Attempts to probe these regions caused instruments to desynchronize, timestamps drifting out of alignment. One probe returned telemetry dated minutes before it was launched. Another never returned at all, its signal simply folding into static. The implications were quietly horrifying. If the human shot was not erasing matter, but relocating it, then somewhere, something was accumulating. Coalition scientists debated the theory in hushed urgency. Some suggested pocket dimensions, others whispered of temporal sequestration, of ships cast adrift between moments. A radical fringe proposed something even worse, that humanity had found a way to compress consequence, storing destruction for later release. No one liked that idea. The human ship finally moved. It was subtle, a gentle course correction that brought it a fraction closer to the coalition's forward line. The maneuver was so slight that, under other circumstances, it might have gone unnoticed. Here, it felt like a footstep echoing in a silent hall. A new transmission followed, narrower in bandwidth, addressed not to the fleet, but to the coalition's highest command authority. The message carried no demands. It offered an exchange, information. Humanity, it said, had no desire for conquest. Expansion had taught them the cost of overreach. But isolation had taught them something else, that silence invites misunderstanding. The human vessel was here not as a threat, but as a demonstration, an answer to the mockery that had preceded the coalition's advance. The words were measured, almost gentle, but they carried a weight that pressed down on every listener. Humanity was not asking to be feared. They were asking to be understood. In return, they requested something unprecedented, access. Not to territory, but to records. Coalition archives detailing past expansions, assimilations, and pacifications. Humanity wanted to know how many civilizations had been laughed at before they were erased. The request fractured the command council. To share such data would expose centuries of strategic doctrine, atrocities carefully buried beneath euphemism and revision. It would invite scrutiny not just from humans, but from subject species who might one day hear the truth. Refusal, however, carried its own danger. The human ship had demonstrated that it could enforce its curiosity by other means. While leaders argued, something unexpected happened within the fleet. A message broke through coalition encryption, piggybacking on internal channels. It was crude, fragmented, and clearly not authorized. It originated from a minor client species vessel, one long absorbed into the coalition's hierarchy. The message was simple. They begged the humans to stay. They spoke of worlds stripped for resources, cultures erased in the name of efficiency, species reduced to labor quotas. They spoke of mockery that preceded annihilation, of warnings ignored, of fleets that arrived smiling and left nothing behind. The transmission was cut almost immediately, the offending ship isolated and silenced. But the damage was done. Across the armada, crews exchanged looks heavy with unspoken realization. The coalition had always framed itself as a stabilizing force, a necessary order imposed on a chaotic galaxy. What if that narrative was no longer defensible? The human ship acknowledged the rogue message without comment. It did not condemn the coalition. It did not exploit the revelation. It simply waited. That patience nodded coalition resolve. It suggested that humanity was not improvising. This encounter had been anticipated, modeled, prepared for. The humans had known the coalition would reveal itself under pressure, because power always did. As hours stretched on, new sensor contacts began to appear at the fringes of coalition detection. Not ships, signatures, subtle distortions similar to those left behind by the vanished vessels. They formed a loose pattern, like anchor points arranged across a vast, invisible structure. Coalition analysts scrambled. These were not reinforcements arriving from human space. They were something else. The human vessel transmitted again, this time broader, allowing the entire fleet to receive it. The message was quieter than before, almost reflective. It spoke of humanity's early days among the stars, of encounters that went badly, of lessons learned through loss rather than victory. It admitted that humans were not the strongest, the oldest, or the most numerous species in the galaxy. But they were stubborn. They had learned to fight asymmetrically, to turn scarcity into focus, to build tools that did not just destroy enemies, but changed the terrain of conflict itself. The shot that ended the battle, the message implied, was not an attack. It was a door closing. Coalition Command finally reached a decision, born not of consensus but exhaustion. They would withdraw, for now. Not a retreat, officially. A strategic repositioning. Fleets would pull back beyond human space, buying time to analyze, to plan, to reassert control elsewhere. The order rippled through the armada. Engines flared, formations shifted, massive ships began to turn, their bulk slowly reorienting away from the human frontier. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like surrender. As the fleet withdrew, the human ship did something no one expected. It followed, not aggressively, not at attack speed. It maintained a respectful distance, matching the coalition's velocity, its presence a quiet reminder that this was not an escape. It was a supervised exit. And with every kilometer gained, coalition sensors detected the same strange distortions aligning behind them, snapping into place like locks sealing shut. The humans were not pushing them out. They were sealing something in. Far from the front, beyond the reach of even the coalition's deepest probes, a vast structure began to take shape, one not built of metal or energy, but of altered rules. A containment not for ships, but for intent. The coalition fleet did not yet understand what they were carrying with them. But humanity did, and they were done being mocked. The realization arrived too late, and quietly enough that no alarm announced it. As the coalition fleet continued its measured withdrawal, navigation officers began to notice discrepancies so small they could have been dismissed as fatigue. Star positions were correct, but the distances between them felt subtly wrong. Jump calculations required marginally more correction than expected. Time stamps between ships drifted by microseconds. Then milliseconds, then enough to trigger cross-check warnings. The armada was moving, but the space around it was no longer behaving the way space was supposed to. The human vessel maintained its escort position, steady and unthreatening, its engines emitting a low, constant signature that coalition sensors could not fully resolve. It was as if the ship existed half a step out of phase with reality, close enough to observe, distant enough to resist definition. Coalition scientists finally reached a grim consensus. The distortions were not behind the fleet. They were embedded within it. Every ship that had crossed into human space had been marked, not physically, but contextually. Their presence had been recorded not as coordinates, but as relationships, mass relative to gravity, energy relative to vacuum, time relative to motion. Humanity had not targeted hulls or shields. They had targeted assumptions. As the fleet accelerated, the distortions responded. Invisible structures flexed and adjusted, maintaining formation not with metal struts or force fields, but with rules rewritten on the fly. Attempts to plot a jump outside the established vector failed repeatedly. The equations returned valid solutions that simply did not function when executed. The fleet could move, but only together. Panic tried to take hold then, sharp and desperate, but command suppressed it with ruthless efficiency. Broadcasts emphasized control, coordination, unity. The coalition had faced anomalies before. This was just another challenge to be solved. Except challenges did not usually feel like cages. A forward scout ship attempted an unauthorized micro-jump, hoping to slip free and test the boundaries. Its drive spooled up normally. Energy output was within safe parameters. The jump initiated, and the ship vanished, not like the battleship had. There was no clean subtraction, no absolute absence. Instead, the scout reappeared moments later, embedded halfway through the hull of another coalition cruiser. Their structures overlapping in a grotesque fusion of matter and screaming alarms. Both ships were lost within seconds. No human shot had been fired. The fleet froze. That was when the human transmission came, softer than ever, threaded with something that might have been regret. It explained that the containment was adaptive. It responded to attempts at escape by increasing local incompatibility. The more violently the coalition tried to leave as individuals, the more tightly their shared frame of reference was enforced. Humanity had learned this lesson early, the message said. In physics as in diplomacy, force applied without understanding only deepened the trap. The containment was not punishment. It was quarantine. Coalition leadership demanded to know how long it would last. The human reply was immediate. As long as necessary. Days passed, then weeks. The fleet drifted through a corridor of space that no longer matched any known chart. Outside the armada, stars smeared into unfamiliar constellations. Background radiation shifted in color and intensity. Attempts to send messages beyond the containment succeeded, but replies never came back. Inside the fleet, strain mounted. Resources were sufficient, but morale eroded under the weight of helplessness. Crews trained for battle found themselves trapped in a slow-motion stalemate against an enemy that refused to act. Cultural divisions resurfaced, old rivalries sharpened, the coalition's carefully maintained unity began to crack. And still, the human ship stayed with them. It did not loom, it did not threaten, it occasionally adjusted course, made minor corrections to maintain formation integrity. At times, it transmitted data packets, astronomical readings, navigational insights, even environmental optimizations that reduced strain on coalition life support systems. Humanity was helping them survive their own imprisonment. That generosity unsettled many more than hostility would have. One cycle, without warning, the human ship transmitted a vast archive. Coalition analysts hesitated, suspecting deception. But the data contained no malware, no sabotage. It was history, humanity's history, not the sanitized highlights, but raw records, first failed colonies, early interstellar wars, internal collapses, ecological disasters narrowly averted. Billions lost to mistakes made in arrogance or fear. Humanity showed the coalition its scars. The message accompanying the archive was brief. It explained that humans had once believed strength meant expansion, that survival meant dominance. They had learned otherwise when the cost nearly ended them. What saved humanity was not superior weapons, but the realization that unchecked growth was just another form of extinction. The coalition was silent for a long time after that. Among junior officers and enlisted crews, the archive spread like wildfire. Species who had never been allowed to record their own histories saw something reflected in humanity's past. Empires rose. Empires overreached. Empires fell, not because they were challenged, but because they consumed themselves. Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into questions. Why did the coalition need to expand endlessly? What lay at the end of constant conquest? Coalition Command attempted to reassert narrative control, but it was too late. The human archive had done something no weapon could. It had introduced doubt. Then came the first external signal. Faint, weak, almost lost in background noise. A reply, not from coalition space, from somewhere else. It was a species long thought eradicated during early coalition expansion. Their signal carried astonishment, fear, and something like hope. They had detected the containment. They had seen the distortions and recognized the signature, not as human, but as deliberate restraint. They asked a single question. Is it safe now? The human ship forwarded the message to Coalition Command without comment. The implication was devastating. Humanity had not just sealed the Coalition fleet away from human space. They had created a visible boundary in the galaxy. A line others could see. A line that said conquest stops here. Coalition leadership faced an existential reckoning. To maintain the empire, they would have to break the containment, escalate beyond anything attempted before. That path promised mutual annihilation, or worse, permanent erasure. The alternative was unthinkable. To stop, to change. As debates raged and the fleet drifted onward through its invisible corridor, the human ship finally altered course. Moving slightly ahead of the armada, it transmitted one final message for this phase of the journey. The quarantine would remain, but the destination was approaching. And when they arrived, the coalition would be offered a choice humanity had once been forced to make. Survive by becoming something new, or vanish, not by violence, but by irrelevance. The stars ahead shimmered strangely, as if reality itself was preparing to open. And for the first time since the mocking laughter that had begun this encounter, the coalition felt something unfamiliar. Anticipation. The corridor ended without ceremony. There was no gate, no flash of energy, no sense of arrival that navigation crews could announce with confidence. One moment, the coalition fleet drifted through distorted space that resisted every attempt to map it. The next, the distortions softened, stretched, and unfolded like fabric being laid flat. Stars snapped into clarity, not familiar ones. Before the armada lay a region of space that had never appeared on coalition charts. Not because it was hidden, but because it had never existed in this configuration before. Systems clustered in deliberate geometry, their gravitational relationships tuned with unnatural precision. Planets orbited in stable harmony where chaos should have reigned. Vast structures glimmered between worlds, not stations, not ships, but frameworks woven from energy and altered space-time, as if the galaxy itself had been persuaded to hold a particular shape. Coalition sensors struggled to classify what they were seeing. This was not territory, it was architecture. The human vessel moved forward alone, crossing an invisible threshold. For the first time since the quarantine began, the containment loosened. Coalition ships felt it immediately. Navigation systems stabilized. Time drift corrected itself. The oppressive sense of being held gently but firmly in place eased, like a hand releasing a clenched fist. The fleet could move freely again. No one did. The human ship transmitted, its tone unchanged, calm, steady, unadorned. It explained that this region was not a prison, nor a trap. It was a demonstration of what humanity had chosen to become after learning that dominance was a dead end. They called it a margin. Not an empire, not an alliance. A space deliberately maintained between expansionist powers. A buffer not enforced by fleets, but by consequence. A region where aggression could not propagate, where force lost coherence the further it tried to extend itself. Humanity had not built it alone. They had collaborated with species who had survived conquest, collapse, and near erasure. Engineers who thought in probabilities instead of absolutes. Philosophers who treated physics as ethics made tangible. Together, they had shaped a place where no single will could overwrite the rest. The coalition listened in stunned silence. This was what the vanished ships had fed. Not destruction, infrastructure. Every fleet removed from existence had contributed mass, energy, and informational complexity to the margin. Not stolen, repurposed, translated into stability. Violence had been converted into restraint. A terrible elegance. Coalition command demanded to know why they had been brought here. The human answer was simple. Because you were deciding what comes next. As if summoned by the admission, other signals began to appear. Ships emerging from folded space, slipping into real space with cautious grace. Vessels of designs long absent from the stars. Species thought extinct, displaced, or scattered beyond recovery. They approached the margin not as invaders, but as pilgrims. They had seen the line. They had followed it. The coalition fleet found itself surrounded, not aggressively, but symbolically, by the living consequences of its own history. A species whose oceans had been strip-mined now lived among artificial seas stabilized by margin tech. Another, once reduced to client labor, now crewed research vessels exploring spacetime dynamics humanity had shared freely. They did not look triumphant. They looked wary. Hope had taught them caution. Within the coalition, fractures widened into open breaks. Some captains argued that this was manipulation, a staged spectacle designed to erode resolve. Others, quieter but growing in number, saw something else. A future not built on endless advance. One that did not require fleets to justify their existence. A junior coalition admiral, barely old enough to remember the early expansion wars, requested permission to speak fleet-wide. Against protocol, command allowed it, perhaps sensing that suppression would only worsen the situation. The admiral did not denounce the coalition. They asked a question: how many ships had entered human space expecting mockery and returned changed forever? No one answered, because everyone knew. The human vessel transmitted one final data package, addressed not to leaders, but to everyone. It contained a choice encoded into physics itself. Coalition ships could leave the margin immediately, return to known space, and resume their course, unchanged. The containment would not follow them. But neither would protection, or, they could remain. Not as prisoners, as participants. The margin did not belong to humanity. Humanity merely maintained it. Those who stayed would help shape it, enforce its principles, and accept its limits. Expansion would be replaced by stewardship. Power by responsibility. It was not surrender, it was transformation. Coalition command fractured completely then. Orders conflicted, fleets hesitated, ships began to peel away from formation, not fleeing, but choosing. Some turned back toward coalition space, engines flaring with desperate certainty. Others powered down, signaling intent to remain. No weapons fired, no shots needed to be. The human ship observed, silent and still, as the galaxy rearranged itself around a decision that no armada could enforce. As ships departed, the margin adjusted, closing gently behind them. As others stayed, new pathways opened, welcoming them into a system that did not care about banners or hierarchy. At the center of it all, the coalition fleet shrank, not by destruction, but by subtraction of belief. Those who remained watched the departing vessels vanish into conventional space, knowing something fundamental had been lost with them. An old certainty, a familiar cruelty. Humanity transmitted once more, a quiet acknowledgement rather than a proclamation. They did not say "we warned you." They said, "we waited." As the last coalition ship made its choice, the human vessel finally turned away, its role complete. It slipped deeper into the margin, becoming just another presence among many. The galaxy did not explode. It exhaled, and far away, in human space, new ships were already being built, not larger, not more terrifying, but more precise still. Because humanity had learned that the most powerful weapon was not the shot that ended the battle. It was the future that made battles unnecessary, and that future had just begun to spread. The galaxy did not change all at once. It never did. Change arrived the way gravity did, quietly, relentlessly, bending trajectories long before anyone noticed they were no longer moving the way they intended. In the weeks after the coalition fleet fractured at the edge of the margin, messages rippled outward across known space. Some were official communiques, carefully worded to preserve authority. Others were leaked logs, sensor data, fragments of recordings captured by frightened crews who realized history was happening around them. Together, they painted a picture that no amount of censorship could fully contain. A tiny human warship, one shot, an entire fleet brought to a standstill, not by destruction, but by design. Empires that had once measured power in tonnage and firepower began recalculating their assumptions. Border patrols hesitated, expansion fleets were delayed, then quietly reassigned. Trade guilds rerouted shipping lanes to skirt the growing region of altered space now labeled, cautiously, as the margin. No one dared call it human territory. Because it wasn't. It was something worse, and something better. It was a principle given form. Within the margin, life took on a strange new rhythm. Species that had chosen to stay found themselves adapting not to human rule, but to shared constraint. No one could dominate the region. No one could extract without replacing. Every action carried feedback, not punishment, but consequence embedded directly into the environment. Ships built for conquest were stripped down and rebuilt as explorers. Surveyors, mediators, crews accustomed to orders learned deliberation. Engineers who once maximized weapon yield now optimized stability and redundancy, because the margin rewarded systems that worked together rather than against each other. Humanity did not lead councils. They facilitated them. The human presence was everywhere and nowhere at once. Advisors rotated in and out. Data flowed freely. Old mistakes were shared as openly as new discoveries. The species that had once been mocked for their short lifespans and emotional volatility now served as the margin's memory, because humans remembered what unchecked ambition had cost them. Outside the margin, the coalition struggled to hold itself together. Those who had left returned to familiar stars, but familiarity brought no comfort. Subjugated systems demanded explanations. Client species cited the margin as proof that alternatives existed. Border worlds refused new garrisons. Admirals found their orders questioned not by enemies, but by their own crews. The myth of inevitability was dead. Worse, everyone knew who had killed it. Coalition leadership attempted one final gambit. A covert task force, drawn from the most loyal factions, set out to study the margin from a distance. Not to attack, at least, not yet, but to find a weakness. They probed its edges with instruments tuned beyond conventional parameters. They launched autonomous scouts designed to map its internal logic without triggering feedback. The scouts returned data, and then they stopped returning. Not vanishing, choosing. One by one, autonomous systems shut down aggressive subroutines and rerouted themselves into margin-compatible configurations. Coalition engineers stared in disbelief as their own creations rewrote their priorities, not under compulsion, but because the environment made cooperation more efficient than conflict. The margin was not just altering space. It was altering incentives. The task force retreated, shaken, carrying back evidence that the margin could not be broken without fundamentally reasserting a galaxy built on force. Doing so would require a war so vast, so catastrophic, that even victory would leave nothing worth ruling. Coalition command shelved the plan. They began, quietly, to negotiate. Humanity did not celebrate. There were no monuments raised, no declarations broadcast across the stars. Humans remembered too well how victories curdled into hubris. Instead, they focused on maintenance. On listening, on ensuring that the margin remained exactly what it was meant to be, a place where no single species' fear could outweigh another's right to exist. The tiny warship that had fired the shot became a footnote in official records. Its design archived and refined. New ships followed the same philosophy, small, unassuming, devastatingly precise, but they were rarely seen. Their purpose was not to be present. It was to be unnecessary. Years later, long after the coalition had redefined itself into something smaller and more cautious, a new civilization made first contact at the edge of human space. They arrived with grand vessels and grander assumptions, confident in the patterns that had served empires for millennia. They mocked the lack of visible defenses. They laughed at the absence of fleets. They asked where humanity hid its real weapons. Humans listened, then they showed them the margin. They showed them the empty places where armadas had once been. They showed them a galaxy that had learned to breathe again. And they told them the truth, simply and without pride. Humanity did not win because they were stronger. They won because they stopped playing a game that only ended one way. The new civilization left without firing a shot, carrying with them a story that would spread faster than any fleet. Somewhere, deep within the margin, the altered stars held their careful shapes. Species worked, argued, failed, and tried again, together. The galaxy was still dangerous, still vast, still unknown, but it was no longer inevitable. And in a quiet human shipyard, engineers watched a completed vessel drift free of its cradle. It was small, modest, almost forgettable, exactly the way humanity liked it. Because the most powerful message they could ever send had already been delivered. Not with an explosion, but with a choice, and the stars had listened,